If I don't mask with my social behaviors, is that me being untruthful because I'm not doing what I would normally do? Or is doing what I would normally do the untruthful thing because it's masking? Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, Neurodivergent. My name's Jen, and on this channel, I make content about being a female diagnosed with autism and ADHD. In this video, I thought I'd walk you through what my diagnosis appointment was like, and if you stick around until the end of this video, you'll learn about a new series I plan to start on this channel sharing your stories. Yeah, you out there in audience land, watching me right now. You. But before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that for every person that hits that like and subscribe button, a fairy gets its wings. That's just facts and science. But what's not facts and science is me being any kind of mental health professional. I want to stay on the good side of the YouTube overlord, so I have to remind everyone that I can't diagnose you or give you any kind of mental health advice. And any information I provide about the tests or evaluations I went through is to the best of my knowledge, but it's still coming from some girl on YouTube. If you want reliable information on stuff like that, you should, well, talk to someone who actually works in this field. The main purpose of this video is simply to inform viewers about what my own personal experience was like. Anyway, I am yet another case among many of females getting diagnosed later in life. I received my diagnosis in September of 2021 at the ripe old age of 39. If you missed my introductory video on what made me seek a diagnosis in the first place, I'll link to that in the description below. The diagnosis process may differ for you depending on who is doing the diagnosing. My appointment was a mixture of standardized testing as well as a clinical interview. However, there are some professionals who don't do any standardized testing and just do the interview portion. I personally believe having some kind of standardized testing and an interview is best practice because that latter part can be subjective. A diagnostician's conclusions can differ depending on the level of knowledge they have about ASD or ADHD and can be influenced by their own personal biases. I see this in stories over and over again where someone walks in and the evaluator immediately writes them off because they were able to make eye contact or because they find out they were able to hold a steady job. Sadly, this kind of dereliction is very much alive and well in the mental health world. So while the specifics of experiences may vary, mine went a little something like this. According to my report, I came to the testing session on time. Yeah, because I'd literally been counting down the days and it was one of the biggest things on my mind for weeks. And I was dressed appropriately for the weather. That was because the weather happened to coincide with what I was wearing, not the other way around. Had this interview taken place in winter, my report might have read, this chick showed up in a summer dress in the middle of winter, and I'm very concerned about this level of stupidity. Or, you know, some version of that sentiment in more professional terminology. I also avoided eye contact when greeted in the lobby, apparently. Shocker! Now, I went in there expecting to be able to immediately state my case to the judge in order to convince her of my suspicions. I had 5 pages of notes containing supporting evidence I'd compiled over the past 6 months that I was ready to share. But that was not how it went. And you all know how much we like when things don't go how we planned or imagined them. I was first thrown into a whole bunch of standardized testing, which disappointed me a little because I had so much bottled up that I was dying to get off my chest. But I knew I needed to trust the process. And thankfully, I did get that chance to share my thoughts with her towards the end of our appointment. The list of tests I took require me to throw a whole bunch of acronyms at you. So if you're one of those people who just listen to my videos podcast style, I'll put a list on the screen of what all these acronyms stand for if you actually care to know what the names of these tests are. The tests I took included the ADOS-2, parts of the MIGDOS-2, the SRS-2, the WAIS-4, the adult version of the brief testing, the IVA-2, and a PAI. That was a whole lot of testing. Some of these tests were computer administered, some were written, and some were interactive. A few of the computer administered tests were also emailed to my husband to complete as well. A lot of professionals like to involve a parent or spouse if possible. However, this isn't essential for an autism diagnosis. A lot of professionals just find it helpful. Anyway, I'll start with the AuDhD, which is used in autism testing. It involved a series of tasks I had to complete under observation. There were several activities involved in this test, but I'll share just a few of the ones that stood out to me. For one of them, I was asked to pick objects out of a bag and tell a story with them. I think I picked out a tiny candle, a car because I figured that could play a role in my story somehow, and tiny playing cards because I'm a huge fan of poker. I felt like my story needed a splash of my personality in there somewhere. Now, I'll admit, I failed to involve any plots, antagonists, or conflicts, so I don't think my story's going to be hitting Netflix anytime soon. But I gave myself an E for effort. Should you choose to seek a diagnosis and you get this test, just go with your gut. Your story can be as long or as short or as creative as you imagine. I joke about plots and antagonists, but that has nothing to do with it. They are looking for something specific in this test, and no, I'm not going to tell you what that is. I then told a story based on a book that only contained pictures, was asked to describe what was going on in a Where's Waldo type poster, and I was asked to make up a story without any materials while standing in the middle of the room. I believe I was also asked to construct a puzzle at some point. Now, I'll admit, a lot of the activities in this assessment seemed kind of childlike, and some have criticize this test as not being appropriate for adults because of this. However, this is currently considered the gold standard instrument by most for diagnosing ASD in adults because it has different modules for diagnosing adults and adolescents. Under the AuDhD section of my report, it was noted that I was able to use sentences in a largely correct fashion with complex speech, and that my intonation, volume, and rate of speech seemed pretty normal. But that I also had fleeting eye contact during this time, and that some of my responses tended to be socially awkward.
Welcome to my life.
Next up was the social responsiveness scale, which, as you might have guessed, measured my social impairments. This is primarily used to look for ASD and to quantify its severity. This was computer administered and is one of the tests that my husband was also asked to complete as well. It asks things like, I am much more uncomfortable in social situations than when I'm by myself. Check. My facial expressions send the wrong messages to others about how I actually feel. Double check. The responses add up to a numerical T-score to determine if you fall into the normal, mild, moderate, or severe range. The averages between my and my husband's scores put me in the moderate range. After this, I did the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is basically an IQ test that measures cognitive and intellectual abilities. The tasks included things like identifying vocabulary words, doing math problems, replicating designs with blocks, and doing a symbol search on pieces of paper. I actually remember when I did that symbol search that she told me no one can ever get them all done within the time limit, so to not worry about that and just get as many done as I could before the timer went off. And I thought to myself, I'll show you. I'll be the first ever to get all of them done, and you'll be so amazed, you'll want to take my picture and put it up on your wall of fame or something. I did not end up on her wall of fame. Anywho, the intelligence test is obviously not used to look for ASD or ADHD specifically, but it is typically included in most evaluations. I fell down the rabbit hole of research on this one to see if I could understand how this ties into ASD and ADHD testing, and to be honest, I couldn't find much. I think it makes sense that it's in there, but I just couldn't identify a connection. If anyone out there knows more about this, please share that information in the comments section below. During my research, I did learn that people with ASD tend to score lower on certain portions of this testing, like processing speed and working memory, when compared to the general population. So maybe that plays a role, or the evaluators may be looking to identify comorbidities like intellectual disability, but those are just some of my guesses. I do know that there is some ongoing discussion in the autism community about whether or not processing speed should be included in IQ scoring for us, because we tend to be equivalent in almost all other areas. Therefore, a person who has autism might score lower than someone who doesn't have autism, which may not be accurately representative. Next was a test to measure my executive function. It asked things like, I find it easy to stay focused on my work, or procrastination is not usually a problem for me. This test can be used for ADHD and autism, but it can be used for a bunch of other things as well. This was a computer-administered test and was the other one my husband also filled out. Funny enough, my husband scored me lower than I scored myself because, get this, you guys, he overthought something for once. The options were never, sometimes, and often, and apparently he felt like there needed to be something between never and sometimes for rarely. So whenever he felt my behaviors weren't quite enough to be sometimes, he selected never to err on the side of caution. The average between our scores showed no clinical elevation for my executive functioning. Even with my husband scoring me lower, my higher score just barely put me at mildly elevated. My report said I had some executive functioning strengths, which might seem odd considering my ADHD diagnosis. But remember, neurodivergence is a spectrum, and this just wasn't one of the areas where I tested with clinical concern. But it was not all butterflies and rainbows. My report noted that I tend to be impulsive, have difficulty stopping my own behaviors at appropriate times, that I procrastinate frequently, and that I don't do well with changes in plans or routines. I just scored well enough in other areas to balance out my overall executive functioning score, but many people on the spectrum struggle a lot more in this specific area. After this came the visual and auditory response test, which examined my ability to sustain attention and regulate impulsivity. This was a computer-administered test where I was supposed to click the mouse when I saw a dot on the screen or heard a beep in my headphones. Not gonna lie, I was super confused as to how this test would tell her if I had autism or not. But once again, I just trusted the process and that it had a purpose, and it did. Even though I told her I thought I'd been misdiagnosed with ADHD all those years ago, she still suspected it, so she snuck this one in there. The final computer-administered test was the PAI, which stands for Personality Assessment Inventory. This test has actually been used in hiring practices or custody arrangements in addition to clinical evaluations, and I was somewhat familiar with it due to my previous line of work. It asks similar questions in overlapping manners to ensure validity. It's another one of those tests that isn't geared towards identifying ASD or ADHD specifically, but rather to rule out or detect the presence of any clinical psychopathologies. If you've made it this far, I'm sure you're wondering, what the heck the purpose of a lot of those tests were, because you better believe I was wondering the same thing. When I did my follow-up appointment to go over the results, curiosity got the best of me, and I of course asked her what she was looking for in a lot of them. And at this point, you might be hoping I'll tell you what all those strange tests meant, but I'm not going to do that. Should you choose to seek a diagnosis, I want you to be yourself and go with your gut so that you know your diagnosis was valid and not that your results were manipulated because some girl on the internet gave you the answers. Now, I know a lot of you out there wonder if it's even worth pursuing a diagnosis for a lot of reasons. Some people are afraid they won't get a diagnosis because they mask. There were plenty of times in the interview where I know I was masking with some of my social behaviors. I mean, I've been masking my whole life. I've had decades of practice. Like many of you, I don't even know what is me and what is the mask anymore. If I don't mask with my social behaviors, is that me being untruthful because I'm not doing what I would normally do? Or is doing what I would normally do the untruthful thing because it's masking? If you've got a good evaluator, they should be able to take a combination of factors into consideration. That's why you want to ideally find someone who also does standardized testing. Additionally, if you find someone who has some experience diagnosing females, they will hopefully have a good intuition of what masking looks like. Others might be afraid they'll be embarrassed by being told they're just imagining things. So I want to reassure you with something my psychologist told me in our follow-up appointment. I was really seeking reassurance that my diagnosis was valid and that she didn't just tell me what I thought I should hear. So I asked her if people ever came in suspecting they had autism and don't get the diagnosis. She said, absolutely, but that when someone comes into her office, it's not because there's nothing going on. It's because there's something going on. People don't research clinics, call to set up appointments, take time off of work, and pay money out of pocket because there's nothing going on. Worst case scenario is not that she would tell someone they were crazy, but that they were simply suspecting the wrong diagnosis. The good news is that they can provide clarification and help you figure out what's really going on. So whether you get the diagnosis of ADHD, ASD, or something that may present similarly like CPTSD, if you go in there with an open mind, you can look at the diagnosis as an answer, whatever that is. It might be an answer that was different than what you thought it should be, but it might be the right answer. If you go home and research and really give the diagnosis a chance, but still don't feel like it fits you, then I would encourage you to seek a second opinion if possible. But obviously some of the biggest barriers are finances, wait times, and proximity. Here in the US, an evaluation can cost anywhere from $500 to $5,000. And if your insurance doesn't cover it, most people don't have that kind of cash just laying around. The decision to pursue a diagnosis is a personal one, and I can't give you the answers on whether you should seek one out or not. You have to examine your reasonings behind wanting to get one and weigh that with all the other factors involved. For me personally, I'll admit that part of the reason I wanted to get a diagnosis was so that I would be believed. And while this might add some credibility for some, others might still invalidate me by saying the psychologist just told me what I wanted to hear. Basically, some people may not believe you no matter what, and you may just have to learn how to let that go. Of course, that was only part of my reasoning for wanting to get a diagnosis. The other half was because I was seeking answers to explain so much of my life. Either way, if you have autism or ADHD, you won't have it any more or any less based on receiving a diagnosis. Personally, though, I do feel like you should seek a diagnosis from a professional if possible. Not only for your own validation, but to ensure you aren't researching the wrong diagnosis like I mentioned earlier. But again, I acknowledge and understand all of the barriers to receiving one. So what should you do if you do decide to seek out a diagnosis? Well, my suggestions are as follows. Step 1 would be to find a place that diagnoses adults. You'll find hundreds of places that diagnose kids, but places that diagnose adults are on the rise. Find someone that specifically mentions diagnosing adults on their website or literature. Also, make sure you're working with a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Step 2, call to ask if they have anyone that is experienced in diagnosing females and relay your concern about women not getting diagnosed due to masking. I know how much most of us despise making phone calls, but just put one foot in front of the other and dial those numbers. Step 3, ask if they use standardized diagnostic tools. And step 4, ask them if they can work with your insurance or how much the out-of-pocket costs will be. If it's not within your budget or covered by your insurance, ask if they have any referrals. If you live in a remote area and can't find anyone nearby that meets all of these criteria, you could consider less favorable options. But keep in mind that visiting someone less qualified could leave you feeling worse than had you not gone at all if they don't get it right. And I'm not saying that to be all doom and gloom. I'm sharing that to help you guard your heart and to equip you with the knowledge that if you visit someone less qualified and they invalidate your concerns, you're not crazy. They might just be getting it wrong. So I'll wrap it up there, but before I go, I wanted to share some of my future plans for this channel with you that I'm actually pretty excited about. I want to start a series sharing user-submitted stories from other people on the spectrum. Well, I'm sure you're all enjoying my stories. You are enjoying my stories, aren't you? Part of what makes any subject great is a variety of voices, ideas, and experiences. My voice alone might get kind of boring. So I want to share your voice on this channel too. For my first topic, I'm asking for people to share their diagnosis horror stories, similar to what I shared in the beginning of this video if they have one, but I welcome any fun or interesting stories about your diagnosis experience. You can submit them in the comments section below or through my website, neurodivergent.com. When you submit your stories, please let me know if you're okay with me using your first name or if you'd like to remain anonymous. And if you submit something, please be patient, as it will likely take several months for me to get enough of them to justify doing an entire video. So that's it. Hopefully I'll see you in my next videos. Bye for now. Mwah!